We were camping along the Sunshine Coast in Lower Mainland, British Columbia. It was the off-season, so not too many campers in the area, and we were in some beautiful land, lush jungle-like forested area right beside the ocean. 5 a.m. in the morning, right before dusk, right behind our tent. We were camping by literally no other people. I hear this strange sound, like a kind of howl, as loud as it could possibly be. I woke up real quick and asked my husband, "Have you heard it too?" And he said he did. I asked him what he thought it would be, and he said, "Joey, to be honest with you, I think it was a Sasquatch." I'm like, there's no way, and started thinking about all the animals in the area and the different calls they would make. And I'm a pretty avid camper and live in the country, so I recognize plenty of different animal calls. Cougar? No. Bear? No. Owl? Nah, I didn't think so. I didn't go to sleep and kept the knife in my hand for an hour before the sun came up. While I was on my phone, Googling what Sasquatches sound like, I know there's a ton of conspiracy about this, but we did find a recording of a supposed Sasquatch that sounds similar to what we heard. I can't find it now. We went to town later that day and told a local, and he's like, "Yeah, lots of sightings around here. Natives even have a totem dedicated to them." There is something about the Finger Lakes that suggests the possibility of supernatural and mysterious things. Legends and stories abound of hauntings, spirit happenings, utopian communities, ancient ruins, inexplicable phenomena, extraterrestrial visits, and the occasional glimpse of even Sasquatch. Among the most intriguing stories are the numerous reported sightings in the deepest parts of the lake, an aquatic creature, a lake monster, if you will. Each of the Finger Lakes has its own personality, of course, but the Lakes Seneca and Cayuga seem to fit within a different, more mysterious category. Their waters are colder, their moods are darker, their waves are bigger. You can travel on boats to and from the sea to these two lakes, and their sheer size seems to hint at the possibility of ancient aquatic megafauna. Native Americans believed Seneca Lake to be a bottomless lake, with a monster that lived within its depths. Almost 40 miles long, deep, and 1 to 3 miles wide, the pitch-black depths of the lake, hundreds of feet deeper than sunlight can penetrate, descend to depths below sea level. Reports of monsters in Cayuga Lake were numerous, perhaps even routine, in the 1800s. It can be inferred from a story from January 5, 1897, in an edition of the Ithaca Journal. Incredibly, the piece reported that a recent sighting marked the 69th consecutive year in which there was a confirmed encounter with the monster nicknamed Old Greenie. The story went on to recount that a member of the newspaper staff had been living in daily anticipation of Old Greenie's appearance, and had refused reporting assignments that would have taken them near the lake because they were afraid of the monster. The 1897 incident was reported to have been by an Ithaca resident who was driving along the lake's eastern shore and saw what he knew must be the large, long sea serpent. Of course, there were many people trying to debunk it as some sort of otter or muskrat. Sporadic and isolated reports of the creature would continue until about 1929, when people began reporting not one but two creatures sighted together along the lake's eastern shore. The creatures were described by witnesses as being 12 to 15 feet in length. It was speculated that they might be members of the Seneca Lake sea serpent family that found their way into the local waters through a subterranean channel, which is believed to exist between the two lakes. Legends of tunnels connecting Cayuga and Seneca Lakes have circulated for many years, which anyone with a rudimentary grasp of the notion of water seeking its own level knows could be possible. Occasional other reports of Old Greenie have certainly been made since then, including a 1974 attack in which a teenage boy apparently had his arm broken and bit by a large eel-like creature, and the local 1979 encounter by a professional diver of a submerged animal 30 to 35 feet in length. Still, all the reported sightings have been by one or two persons. The incident with the greatest number of witnesses and therefore the most credible lake monster encounter happened on the evening of July 14, 1899, on Seneca Lake. The side-wheeled steamboat Atiani named to evoke the region's Iroquois past, was traveling north toward Geneva from Watkins Glen with several dozen passengers at about 7 p.m. Sunset was at approximately 8:40, so there was plenty of daylight left, and it had been a sunny and seasonably warm day, somewhere between Dresden on the west side of the lake and Willard on the east side. Pilot Frederick Rose reported that approximately 400 yards ahead of the boat was what appeared to be an overturned boat. Captain Carlton Harradine examined the thing with his telescope, later describing its appearance as being 25 feet long, with a very sharp bow and long, narrow stern. Passengers began to gather, and there was a group of ostensibly credible witnesses, including 2 commissioners of public works, a police commissioner, the manager of the Geneva Telephone Company, and a geology professor. As Captain Harradine completed his inspection, the pilot signaled the engineer to slow down the boat. The steamboat approached to within 100 yards and lowered a boat to take a closer look. Suddenly, the object turned and began to move away. The captain immediately ordered full speed ahead as the thing was moving slowly, and the steamboat gained on it easily. The object turned again, this time toward the steamboat, raising its head and looking in the direction of the boat and opening its mouth, displaying 2 rows of sharp white teeth. Captain Harradine declared that he would ram the creature and take it alive if possible. Otherwise, he would kill it and take it aboard or tow it to Geneva. This was the United States in 1899, when conservation of flora and fauna was still kind of fringe out west. The bison population, perhaps 10 million in 1850, had been reduced to fewer than 1,000. Passenger pigeons, numbering in the billions in 1860, were on the brink of extinction. So, the boat was turned so that it would approach the creature from the side at a ramming speed. The deck of the steamboat was crowded with passengers who were ordered by the captain to put on life preservers. According to the Geneva Gazette, every eye on deck was fixed on the monster, and hardly a person was breathing normally. While the boat was yet some distance from it, the monster again looked at the boat, sank out of sight, and the boat passed over the spot where it had been. As the steamboat approached within 50 yards of the creature, the captain gave the order to turn the boat so that its paddle wheel would strike the creature midway between its head and tail. The boat went full steam ahead and struck the monster with enough impact that many of the passengers were thrown off their feet. The mortally wounded animal lay in the water next to the steamboat. It raised its head, gave a sound like a gasp, and lay quiet. Its spinal column had been broken, and it was dead. Lifeboats were immediately lowered, and lines were strung around the body as passengers and crew tried to secure the carcass. In the end, though, it proved too heavy or unwieldy and dropped into the water, sinking 600 feet to the bottom of Seneca Lake. The ship reached Geneva after dark, and the passengers began to tell their stories of the incident. While all agreed that a monster had been seen, different versions of the length of the monster, from 25 feet to as much as 90 feet, strained the credibility of the accounts. The Rochester Herald said that Professor George R.L. Wood, the geologist on board who had been in one of the lifeboats trying to secure the body, gave what was considered the most careful and perhaps most trustworthy account. He thought it was a cladestis, an extinct marine lizard from the mosasaur family that lived in what is now the United States, until it disappeared from the fossil record at the end of the Cretaceous period, about 66 million years ago. Now, we can't let skepticism get the better of us, considering that in December of 1938, a South African fisherman caught a coelacanth, a fish that was thought to have been extinct and disappeared from the fossil record at the end of the Cretaceous period, 66 million years ago. So, it is entirely possible that this thing could have existed. Professor Elwood went on to describe the creature as about 25 feet long, with a tail that tapered until within about 5 feet of the head, which broadened out and looked much more like a whale. The creature weighed about 1,000 pounds. Its head was perhaps 4 feet long and triangular, with a very long mouth armed with 2 rows of triangular white teeth, as sharp as those of a shark, but in a shape more like that of a sperm whale. Its body was covered with a horny substance, which was much like the carapace of a terrapin. This horny substance was brown in color and had a greenish tinge. The belly of the creature, which I saw after the rope slipped and the carcass was going down, was cream white. Its eyes were round like those of a fish and did not wink. For years, the question of what it could have been has been speculated around the area, the country, and even the world. It hardly seems likely that so many people could have imagined something so vivid if there had been nothing there. Lake sturgeon, indigenous to both big lakes, can live to be as old as 100 years, grow to 9 feet long and 300 pounds. Their skin is like a shark-like dull gray. Eels are darker but smaller, not getting much longer than 5 feet. Muskellungi can also grow over 5 feet long and weigh 70 pounds plus, with rows of sharp teeth. None are apt to convince a boatload of people that they were in the presence of a 25-foot monster, though. It was suggested by cynics that the whole thing was a hoax perpetuated by the passengers and crew, which is also exceedingly unlikely. Dozens of people would have had to keep that secret for the rest of their lives. While human nature suggests that no group larger than 3 people can be trusted to reliably keep a secret for a long weekend, the Geneva Historical Society can document at least 20 separate reported sightings of the Seneca Lake monster, most recently in 2013. Cayuga's Old Greenie even has a Facebook page. Clearly, the idea that big lakes harbor mysteries beyond our knowledge is one that is held stubbornly and collectively in our imagination. It's part of the charm of living in small towns, especially lake towns. In October of 2015, I was in my freshman year at Chapel Hill, studying economy and playing rugby. I used the econ training to come up with Excel spreadsheets that predicted fantasy football performance. I was able to make what felt like a lot of money being in my freshman year of school. Then, a concussion rocked my brain so hard that I couldn't even stare at the screens long enough to update the spreadsheets. After a month of missing almost every class, I went back to Pennsylvania on medical leave to fight depression. I used my fantasy football winnings to take an impulsive trip to the High Peaks region of New York on November 16, 2015. I left an hour after I had the thought. To leave November in North Carolina is much different from November in upstate New York. So, before I started hiking, I stopped in an outfitter nearby called the Mountaineer. At the time, frankly, the man running the store had me a little angry. He politely inquired about my plans, asking if I was in the search party. "No," I replied. "I'm climbing Dick's Peak tomorrow." The owner asked, "No, today?" And the man looked at me with surprise and concern. "And how do you plan to do that?" I just looked at the man and said, "Well, I'm just gonna climb it." "Do you even have microspikes?" And from that, I learned that I would find snow and ice as I ascended in elevation. I picked up the spikes. The man encouraged me to buy a headlamp, but I assured him that I already had more than one. Before I left, he sincerely asked me not to hike, as the sun sets at 4:30. "So you better run. You'll be the next one we're searching for." And so, I drove down the road to this pond and began my hike at 9:30 a.m. No one had signed the trail, and it looked like no one had even used it for at least 2 days. The current day was November 15th. Though there was no snow at the start of the trail, as I ascended, snow quickly accumulated. Without the microspikes, I couldn't have hiked because the trails had ice completely over them. After about a mile and a half, I ate my lunch on the summit of Mount Dix at 2:30 p.m. It was cold, only 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The ice that hit me was the realization that the sun was getting very low, and being at the summit, I was only halfway. The last mile of the hike had been extremely difficult rock scrambling, which in this weather was really ice climbing. Snow was over a foot deep, making my crawl down turn down at about 3:45 p.m. I emerged from the rock scramble and decided my best move was to jog, or if the trail allowed it, I would run, despite the impending night. In my isolation at this time, my main concern was what started as an utter silence while I crawled down the icy rocks. Ascending, I heard many birds, but my descent was absolutely silent. The moment I started running to beat the sun, I couldn't help but notice the regularity and the branches cracking to my left. Even though my feet only hit snow, I felt like I was being watched from the left, even though I had never even seen anything. I should have felt the deepening cold to ease my mind. I decided to stop my jog suddenly, thinking that a creature running with me would take a few extra steps before it realized I was not moving. Nothing. I did it again. Nothing. I'm crazy, I thought to myself. And then I did it one more time, and I heard leaves shuffle in the woods to my left. Now, I ran. I was breathing hard when a river crossing came up ahead. I saw the same ice-covered rocks that I had to jump across to get there, and I hit them at speed. This led to my right leg slipping off a rock, and my legs plunging through the ice and into the frozen river. I sprawled out my hands to grab the rock, to not get sucked under the ice. It worked. I pulled myself up. The force in my hands smacking the rock had broken my new flashlight, almost in half. The cylinder cracked, and the water got inside the wiring. Now, I did not care if anything ran with me in the woods. I threw the contents of my bag until I had searched every nook and cranny for another flashlight or my headlamp. I found no headlamp. I couldn't even find my spare handheld flashlight. I had spare wool socks, and I changed out of my socks, even though it was now 14 degrees. My boots were still soaked with water, which made the sock change ineffective. My mind raced, trying to decide if I should make a fire or make a run for my truck. It was still 4.5 miles from my truck, with no lights but my iPhone. I brought it out and realized that the cold had taken my battery down to 12%. It worked for less than 7 minutes before the cold forced it to shut off, a defect of the older iPhone models. I decided to run, except with no lights. I couldn't move much faster than a walk. At first, the waning sunlight kept my tracks just barely visible. I was soaked from the waist down. I wiggled my toes once they started to go numb, and the panic made me move faster. But immediately following the river that I fell in was a valley where the moonlight could not penetrate the trees. I believe that about an hour and a half had gone by when I realized that I was constantly getting whipped in the face by branches. The snow was almost up to my thighs. I stopped. There were no tracks in front of me. I was not following the trail. You panic. You die in these situations. That thought was all that kept me calm. I turned around and followed the tracks that had gotten me here, hoping to backtrack to the original trail. Despite the loss of feeling in my feet, I went slow to not lose my trail another time. It worked. I found the trail, but with precious time lost. Despite the gloves on my hands, I began to feel the numbness sink into my hand, and I reasoned that the blood in my body must be rallying to my central organs. In this moment, I realized that I could choose between comfortable thoughts and motivating thoughts. Either I could think of a hug, a warm room, and a campfire, and this would make me feel momentarily okay. Or I could think about what I would lose out on by lying down and basically dying. I just kept on thinking about how badly I didn't want to die alone in the woods like this. I came out of the valley and realized my last mile or so downhill was right in front of me. There would be moonlight, but my steps became clumsier because I was having extreme difficulty feeling my feet. So, even though I could see a bit from the moonlight, I kept stumbling. At last, I saw the round pond and knew I was a quarter mile from the truck. I wouldn't let anything hold me back now. I felt new strength and could see the trail log when I noticed a black creature on the trail in front of me. It was just pawing the ground, blocking my way. This thing was maybe 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, but very short to the ground. I yelled at it, cursed at it, screamed like a man who wasn't going to let himself die 200 feet from his truck. But this thing wouldn't move. It just pawed the ground, and the trail was a gully about 8 feet high to each side. I couldn't climb that in my state. I threw a stick and still, it didn't move. Now, I finally threw a stick that bounced off the creature. It growled and stared. It flexed like it could attack. I screamed non-stop. I knew it was a wolverine. And suddenly, he just turned around. He just walked away before he scrambled up the side of the ravine. I eventually walked out. My truck was only 200 feet away. Once in my truck, I warmed myself slowly over the course of an hour, aware that if I heated myself too quickly, then I'd be more than likely to lose some skin to frostbite. Even though my phone turned back on, I had no service, so I just sat there, eating Kit Kats, wishing I had bought that headlamp from the Mountaineer. A few years later, I sat down and watched the Missing 411 movies, and the first story centered around upstate New York, only an hour from where I went hiking. The man went missing on November 15th, 2015, 2 days before I went hiking. I think that's why no one had gone hiking to the Dix Wilderness for 2 days prior to my hike. My mom likes to tell me the story of how my great-grandma could run faster than her. Apparently, they were going fishing in the creek about a mile or so behind my grandma's house when they started smelling some rotten smell and heard splashing. They turned the corner and saw a large humanoid creature covered in dark hair, splashing around and having a good time. They dropped the poles, and Grandma beat my mom back to the house by a good 100 feet. They found several deer carcasses gutted around that time as well. Also, we live in Illinois, so probably not a bear, more likely a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. These experiences occurred at Lake Gogobic in Michigan from 1994 to 1996. I've lived in Michigan all of my life and never been interested in moving anywhere else. My family is here, and it is and always will be my home. During that time span, I was accustomed to hiking along the side of the lake where the brush was thin enough to allow me to do so. There was some private property along the shoreline as well that I avoided by cutting through the woods and coming back toward the lake once I passed. I always wondered if people thought I was a bit creepy just bumbling through the woods, but I did wear a backpack and hiking boots. I'm sure folks that did see me knew what I was doing. Anyway, in 1994, one Saturday morning, I woke up at about 5 when it was still dark out and got my stuff together. I packed some granola bars as I planned to have a peaceful breakfast on the edge of the lake while watching the sunrise. Nothing beats it. After a 30-minute drive, I was exactly where I wanted to be, under a rich canopy in the faint shadows cast by a rising sun. But something felt different. Something felt wrong. Now, before I continue, you must know I had been walking in those woods and next to that lake at least 500 times. I've never once had an eerie feeling while I was out there, but that day, something was different. I felt like I was being watched. At least a dozen times I stopped to listen. I would look around to see no one or anything out of place. Maybe I was still tired or something. Well, I kept on walking, and no longer after, I swear I heard footsteps behind me again. I turned to see who it was, and there was still no one there. The trees were still. There was no wind. I was alone. I started again, walking toward the edge of the water. I was starving and ready to have a seat and start eating, and again, those footsteps came from behind me. "Who's there?" I called out to the motionless forest that surrounded me. No one replied. Waiting for about 15 minutes, I stood as calmly as I could. But to be honest, I was starting to feel more and more uneasy by the second. After hearing nothing, I took a few steps toward a cozy-looking rock by the bank and sat down. I peeled the wrappers from my breakfast and had at it, taking swigs of bottled water in between bites and whistling a tune here and there. What I didn't expect was to hear someone whistling back to me. I stopped, almost choking on my granola. My body was covered in goose flesh as I slid around the rock to face the forest. There was still no one there. Now, more curious than afraid, I drank another gulp of water and whistled again. Once more, after a few seconds, the same tune whistled back to me, plain as day. It was either my first time ever hearing an echo out on this lake, or someone hiding in the woods was trying to scare me. One more time I whistled, expecting to pinpoint exactly where this mimicry was coming from. This time the tune came from directly behind me. I fell forward off the rock and faced the direction it came from while crawling away backward. My heart was pounding out of my chest. All I was able to glimpse was a large splash in the water and the fleeting ripples thereafter. Without a moment of hesitation, I picked up my backpack and ran toward my truck. I didn't set out for Gogabik again for months. I was still spooked after this weird experience. Eventually, I did start my usual hikes again, and for the longest time, I didn't run into anything weird. One day in 1995, though, I did hear the footsteps again, but the moment I heard them, I turned tail and ran back to my truck. I was not about to chance it was something I couldn't even see. The final experience happened in the spring of 1996. This is the experience that confirmed that whatever was happening wasn't echoes, animals in the woods, or some prankster trying to get me. The following experience left me with nightmares still to this day. I had figured that if I just avoided that side of the lake, it'd be okay. I'd be fine. So this time, I parked my truck on literally the opposite side, and that's a big deal. Gogabik is the largest natural lake in Michigan, so I was miles away from where that other weirdness had happened. That day, I had brought a sketch pad and a set of colored pencils. I had gotten into sketching scenery recently, and using that medium really helped me relax and forget my problems, at least for a moment. I was being extremely quiet, not like I was trying to be as quiet as possible, but I was just focused and still when the footsteps came out of nowhere. Those all too familiar footsteps. I looked ever so slowly in the direction they were coming from, expecting to see nothing. For so long I'd been hearing these footsteps, and for so long I'd witnessed them coming from nowhere. Not today. No, this time I saw something, and I can say for sure this was no person. It was standing at the edge of the water, looking out over the lake. It looked hunched over and thin, skin pale as the moon. Just the sight of it made my skin crawl. My heart seemed to stop. I prayed and I prayed in my head, hoping this thing would not see me. There was no telling how long that thing had been walking over there for. But God, even hunched, it was so tall. It stood at least 3 feet over me. I did not want to catch this thing's attention. I stayed put. I didn't move, and I barely breathed. For at least 30 minutes, the creature didn't move as it continued to stare at the water. Finally, it walked slowly forward, taking massive steps into the shallow water before the top of its head disappeared into it. I should have drawn it, but I was too scared to move, and I couldn't make out too much of its face. I continued to sit and wait, breathing slowly. Underwater or not, it was too soon to start running. I waited another half hour just to be safe. My ass started to ache, and the rock underneath me did not feel good after a while. Eventually, I called it. It was time to get the hell home ASAP. I slid my sketchbook and pencil case into my bag and stood up, turning toward the trail. There it was, not 2 yards in front of my face. It stood, staring at me. It was towering over me, yet still standing in the water. The face. God, that face. I finally got a good look at it. It was black, with sunken pits where its eyes should have been. Black sunken pits where its eyes should have been. There was no nose, just wrinkled pink and pale, almost disgusting blue skin. And where the mouth was meant to be was just an absence of anything. With its lacking eyes, it faced me. It stared at me. I slowly backed away, and yet its empty gaze followed me. I had no other choice. I had to run. It reached out to me with a long, thin finger that had no nails. Before it could reach me, I broke into my fastest possible sprint. I did not turn around. I did not glance over my shoulder. The moment I reached my truck, I opened the door, jumped in, and sped away. Since that day, I have not gone back to Lake Gogabik, and I never plan to. 20 years have passed, and I'm an old man now, and I'm still very much afraid of that place. I do not know what I saw. I don't think I ever will. But I have passed these stories down to my kids and my kids' kids in hopes that they will have some sort of idea of what is out there. No matter how smart people think they are, we do not know everything about our planet. There are creatures that elude us. Believe me, I came face to face with one.